Today, we're going to be talking about one of the most legendary figures in history, Alexander the Great. Now, I know what you're thinking. Living history, we know everything there is to know about Alexander. But trust me, there's a lot more to this incredible conqueror than meets the eye. From his early life in the Kingdom of Macedonia to his incredible conquests across Asia, we're going to explore every aspect of Alexander's life and legacy. What was Alexander the Great really like? A genius, billionaire, playboy, and a philanthropist? Or a man who sold entire cities into slavery? So buckle up and get ready to learn something new, because today we're answering some of the most burning questions about Alexander the Great, including why his empire fell apart so quickly after his death. Let's get started. Well, let's start with a simple thing. If you ask 100 people what country Alexander belongs to, 99 will name Macedonia, and they would be right only partially, because the state where Alexander III of Macedon was born in 356 BC was really called the Kingdom of Macedonia. But in fact, it was one of many Greek polices, which existed in tens at that time. Macedonians lived like Greeks, prayed to the same gods as the Greeks, and even spoke a dialect of Greek. The situation was similar to Sparta, which, though self-sufficient, was still generally considered part of ancient Greece. Actually, one of the merits of Alexander is the unification of independent Greek polises into a single state. So it is correct to call him a Macedonian, but from the point of view of history, it is correct to consider Alexander a Greek. Alexander was born from the dynasty, which reigned in Macedonia for 500 years, founded by a guy with a sonorous name, Perdiccas. The country was, for the most part, a backwater populated by barbarians, and prior to Alexander had only been noted in history for its inglorious support of the Persians, who got their asses kicked by the Spartans and the Athenians. It was only Alexander's father, Philip II, who took up the cause and incorporated Greek culture into the country and started to unite Greece. In fact, this is the first myth, because it was Philip, not Alexander at the Battle of Chaeronea, who conquered all of mainland Greece except for Sparta. Macedonian came to the throne at the age of 20 and only finished what he had started, smothered a couple of uprisings, dealt with Sparta, and conquered Thebes. By the way, not a very pleasant story is connected with Thebes. The inhabitants of the city did not treat Macedonia and Alexander badly and were marked by large-scale revolts. In response, Alexander rudely took the city and turned almost the entire population into slaves, and then sold it to pay off his father's debts. Unusual behavior like that for a young man who's only 21, isn't it? And part of the reason is that, in the past, young men matured earlier. It's also Alexander's talent, which has been showing since childhood. Once, in the absence of his father, the 12-year-old received an official delegation of the Persians and, instead of asking about candy, filled the diplomats with questions about the length of roads, the king, and other military minutiae. At 12, Alexander harnessed the mighty horse Bucephalus, who would not submit even to grown-up warriors, and at 18, commanding one of his father's detachments. He destroyed the entire right flank of the united army of Greek polis at the Battle of Chaeronea. It's not just a matter of natural intelligence. Alexander received a splendid upbringing, and more importantly, an education. One of his teachers was Aristotle himself, who was on excellent relations with the Macedonians. The future king of Asia adored reading, of course, mainly leaning on Greek literature. Homer, Herodotus, Xenophonte, and other titans of the quill pens were devoured by Alexander one by one. Many historians believe that it was a combination of commanding skills and a love of science that allowed the great to achieve such success. Being a fan of Greek philosophers, Alexander always did things in unusual ways. For example, even during the legendary campaigns, the guy always kept a horde of scientists, historians and other brainy guys, and conquering another city and terrain, he immediately sent specialists to study them, listen to arguments, and acted. The results speak for themselves. After all, Babylon conquered by Alexander the Great, creation of Alexandria, and in general all the cities he touched, flourished, and became cultural and scientific centers. Military power would go nowhere without production, science, and the good feeling of the inhabitants toward the new government. All this he emphasized from a proper education as a child. But what did Macedon look like? Fortunately, we don't need to turn to literature here. In the Louvre, there is a Roman copy of a sculpture by Lysippus. It is considered to be the only image of Alexander from life which has reached our times, and the works complete the picture, calling Macedonian an incredibly agile and mighty warrior, which is willingly believed, because Alexander's second trick was the morale of soldiers, and as a commander, he always moved ahead of the army, fighting side by side with the soldiers, which in those days was a beautiful but long extinct tradition. By the way, Alexander the Great rarely took the horse Bucephalus to the battlefield, fearing for his health. As a result, the horse lived to the old age by the standards of animals, and in its honor, Alexander in 326 BC founded a town, which he named Bukapala. It still stands to this day, although the name was changed to Jalalpur. Well, the former Bukapala is located in Pakistan, for you to understand how far Macedonian went in his campaigns. Too much has been said about them, and we will not stop on Alexander's conquests especially. I think that everyone knows that after dealing with Greece, Alexander set out on the campaign which lasted for 10 years and would go down in history as the most successful one. Alexander started with the long-standing dream and grievance of all Greeks, Persia. According to a legend, when he sailed up to the coast of Asia, the king threw a spear in its direction, as if to hint to whom the continent would belong. Spoiler alert, that's what happened. Within 3 years, the Persians had fallen, and Alexander took the title of King of Asia, and at the same time became Pharaoh of Egypt, which was happy to be rid of the Persian oppression. Macedonian became bored, and eventually reached as far as India, and according to the old tradition, without suffering a single defeat. This is really a fact. No one has ever defeated Alexander the Great in battle. Just look at the Battle of Issus, after which the Persians finally capitulated. Alexander had 40,000 men, and the Persian king, Darius III, had almost 120,000. Nevertheless, Alexander won, having lost less than 1,000 soldiers, 50 times less than the Persians were killed. In India, the army revolted, grew tired, and Macedonian returned. We touched on this story in part in a video about the history of Babylon, to be released next week, which the king had christened the new capital of the state. So let's talk about something else. Alexander's withdrawal to the conquered territories. He was very clever and thoughtful, conquering Persia. Macedonian did not change anything. The state system in the new territories remained more or less the same. The similar thing can be said about Egypt. Alexander treated the culture and customs of the conquered territories with emphasized respect. With the Egyptians, he walked to the oracle of the god Ammon. He adopted the style of dress from the Persians, instructing all his officials to dress the same way. And in parallel, Alexander immediately drove hordes of ordinary Greeks into new territories, built universities, temples, and neatly promoted Greek culture. This would work perfectly and begin an era of Hellenism throughout Asia and parts of Africa that would outlive Alexander himself by several hundred years. Those who have watched our video about Egypt are aware that even Cleopatra is a product of the Ptolemaic dynasty, which began just after Alexander the Great, and according to historians, even 200 years after Alexander's death, a quarter of the world's population spoke Greek. The approach chosen by the king in the new territories worked. The inhabitants were happy to absorb the Greek way of life. Not surprisingly, given that the great cities were built, Alexandria in Egypt became almost the scientific center of the planet, and even Babylon was given new greatness. Did the Alexander the Great have disadvantages? Of course he did. A humble man would not name 70 cities after himself, would he? Besides, Alexander loved to call himself a child of the gods, whether Greek, Egyptian, or whatever. You couldn't call him a decent family man. He also had a few wives, but it's worth noting that in his dynasty it was common, and the tradition lasted for centuries. It is also worth noting that the cities did not always receive loyalty and bonuses from the new king. We have already mentioned Thebes, and in the year 334 BC Alexander ordered Halicarnassus to be destroyed. In general, his history is full of cities destroyed and sold into slavery. But perhaps the most seldom mentioned detail is the rivals. For only when Alexander received the throne from his father, the first thing he did was to kill all the pretenders to the throne, except for his very weak-minded brother. This, however, was also a traditional move of his dynasty. The rulers of the Macedonians had been slaughtering their rivals for centuries, and they rarely died themselves, more often being the objects of conspiracies and coups d'etat. Here lies the answer to the question of why the vast territory of the empire fell apart almost immediately after the death of Alexander the Great. It is not that everything was held on him. It was just a continuation of the tradition of Alexander's relatives. For as soon as Alexander died, almost all his family, including his children and wife, were slaughtered, and the feud between the rivals began, which caused the state to burst at the seams. And the very circumstances of Alexander's death still raise questions among historians. For too suddenly, and without any preconditions, the emperor died of a mysterious illness. There is even a theory that Aristotle himself had a hand in the death of Macedonian. What other things Alexander was remembered for? First, his traditional love of sodomy. Secondly, a passion for cleanliness and personal hygiene. The emperor always smelled great. And thirdly, the Lord of Asia and the whole world was afraid of cats. Alexander was also adored by Roman emperors, and medieval strategists studied the records of historians to understand the secret of success on the battlefield. Was Alexander the Great a legendary man? Of course he was. Is it possible, knowing all that we have told you, to call him a tyrant? It is also possible. But the reality is that times were very different, and selling a city into slavery or killing a rival to the throne did not sound like a special crime, so it's worth focusing first on Alexander's achievements, which are undoubtedly great. That's it for now. Don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. And also suggest your warriors for future releases in the comments. See you soon, folks.